As South Africa prepared for its first fully free elections, scheduled for late April, tension still simmered in the country, not just between black and white South Africans, but also between the predominantly Xhosa African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, and the predominantly Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party, led by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. The IFP were planning to boycott the elections as they felt the proposed new constitution didn't sufficiently respect the autonomy of KwaZulu and instead wanted the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, to be formally recognised as a head of state. Things came to a head on the 28th of March when a huge march of 20,000 Inkatha members marched on the ANC headquarters at Shell House in Johannesburg to protest, but ANC members in Shell House opened fire on the crowd, killing between 19 and 53 people depending on which source you read. Nelson Mandela later admitted that he had given the go-ahead to defend Shell House with lethal force if necessary, but the exact sequence of events that led to shots being fired remains unclear to this day. Further south, things were not going well in the tiny countries of Rwanda and Burundi, where ethnic tension between the two principal groups in the region, the majority Hutus and the minority Tutsis, had been rising ever since 1990 when the Rwandan Civil War broke out between the primarily Hutu government and the primarily Tutsi Rwandan Popular Front. The history between the groups, of course, goes much further back than that, and is essentially a holdover from German then Belgian colonial policies. The Rwandan Civil War had ended in 1993 with a deal that brought the Popular Front into the government, but by then there'd been 3 years of government fear-mongering about the Tutsis and promotion of so-called Hutu power. Things spilled over into neighbouring Burundi, where the Hutu president was assassinated by Tutsi army officers, sparking a civil war and a 3-month genocide of some 110,000 Tutsis. UN representatives in Kigali were warning that things were still unstable in Rwanda too, when on the 6th of April, the aircraft carrying President Habyarimana of Rwanda and President Ntaryamina of Burundi, both Hutus, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile as it came into land at Kigali airport. The Prime Minister should have taken over, but was killed along with her UN escort of 10 Belgian soldiers as an extremist military coup took place, officers going house to house to murder moderate politicians. Within days, both government forces and armed mobs were roaming the streets of Rwanda, killing Tutsis on sight, and with all the moderate leaders dead, there didn't seem to be much that could be done about it domestically. And the world was shocked on April the 8th to hear the news that Nirvana lead singer Kurt Cobain had been found dead in his Seattle home at the age of 27, having died around 3 days earlier by a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the head. Nirvana, founded in 1988, had had a massive worldwide hit in 1991 with their song Smells Like Teen Spirit, the first single from the album Nevermind, which had essentially created the grunge genre that by 1994 was hugely popular and came to define Generation X, the term popularised by author Douglas Coupland in 1991. But Cobain always found it hard to reconcile enormous commercial success with his punk attitudes, and was frustrated by what he saw as the fakeness of the celebrity industry, he felt victimised by the media, and his artistic ideas misrepresented. He'd been struggling with addiction and depression, and had attempted suicide before. There had been rumours that the band was splitting up, and on 6th of April, the day after his estimated suicide but before the discovery, the others officially withdrew from the upcoming Lollapalooza festival. So, after a cheerful 3 weeks on the global stage, the Formula One gang arrived at a brand new venue in Japan. After the plans for an Asian Grand Prix at Autopolis had fallen through thanks to the owner's suspected Yakuza links, the trial was ongoing as the teams arrived, another possible venue had caught Bernie's eye. Hajime Tanaka had built an entertainment complex for the super-rich in 1990 near the town of Aida in the hills of Okayama Prefecture, which included a racetrack originally intended just for playboys to show off their sports cars, but was up to F1 standards. Editing Matt here, so I went to try and find a picture of the chap, and apparently Hajime Tanaka is a very common name in Japan because these 3 characters all share that name, including... Look, Japan, are you okay? Do you need to talk? An inaugural race in 1990 between a clutch of British veterans, Stirling Moss, David Hobbs, Dickie Atwood, David Piper, Brian Redman, Mike Knight and Jonathan Williams, had given names to 7 of the 11 corners, but despite the endorsement, the prevailing opinion of experts looking at the track map was that it looked like a lot of slow corners with only one real overtaking spot, the hairpin at turn 5. Nonetheless, Bernie Ecclestone had signed a 3-year deal with the circuit with the option for a further 2. Still, everyone enjoyed going to Japan, and Tanaka-san had spent an awful lot of money building roads and facilities, ensuring that grandstands were sited so the fans could get close to the action, and arranging a big promotional drive. The race was billed as the Pacific Grand Prix, which meant that it would be the first time that an event had exactly the same name as one of the teams competing in it. Anorak fact. Michael Schumacher and Ukyo Katayama were all over the media in their capacity as mobile Mild 7 billboards. Mika Hakkinen took on some local youngsters in a karting event at the Festica circuit north of Tokyo, and Rubens Barrichello had decided to use a bit of his downtime to go visit Disneyland. Quote, "I was leaving the hotel room and ran into Ayrton. He asked me where I was going. I said, 'To Disney,' and he said, 'Cool, can I go with you?' Like I was going to say no. I have a picture of him eating a hamburger in the park. By the way, he ate too. Ayrton was always very focused, dull even, so that moment was special, and I keep the photo until today." End quote. 2 drivers, though, would not be making the trip. Jean Alesi had had a huge shunt testing at Mugello at the end of March, going into the barriers backwards at nearly 250 kph, 150 miles an hour, and cracking 3 cervical vertebrae. A month's complete rest was prescribed, so for the next 2 races at least, Nicola Larini would get his big chance as he took over the number 27 Ferrari. The similarity in Jean's injuries to those suffered by JJ Leto were noticeable, and it seemed to back up the worries about car safety, but it didn't seem like much could be done about it at this stage. The other driver missing was Eddie Irvine, though at least in his case he was absolutely fine, but he'd been adjudged by the Brazilian stewards to have been solely at fault for the 4-car pile-up at Interlagos and handed a 1-race ban. Jordan, feeling this was a little harsh, appealed to the FIA, but apparently neither Eddie was particularly popular with the tribunal, and they rather pettishly increased the penalty to a 3-race ban for wasting their time. Bad news for Irvine, good news for Japan, as local hero Aguri Suzuki, out of a drive for 1994, was able to do a 1-race deal to drive the Jordan at Aida, though not for the other 2 races of the ban. So much for having a stable lineup for 1994. One thing that may not have helped Eddie's case is that on the evening of the Brazilian Grand Prix, Eddie Jordan had filed a protest against the winning Benetton, no doubt hoping to elevate Barrichello to his and the team's first podium, on the grounds that the floor didn't start behind the front wheels as stipulated. The Japanese stewards examined the B194, thought that it was technically legal but not exactly within the spirit of the rules, and referred the matter to Charlie Whiting, who, after some rather tedious back and forth about the exact definitions of words like floor and attached, agreed that the Brazil result would stand as long as Benetton made sure they were compliant going forwards. Car number 15, Aguri Suzuki. Despite his improved performances in the latter half of 1994, the evaporation of Footwork's Japanese money over the off-season and the migration of Mugen Honda engines to Lotus, who already had 3 drivers under contract, left Aguri rather high and dry. He'd signed up to drive for Tom's Toyota in the Japanese Touring Car Championship, which would kick off at Autopolis a week after the Pacific Grand Prix. But, with Eddie Jordan in need of a driver, Aguri managed to get some backers together to allow him to put in an appearance in front of his legion of home fans, though he was not holding out any great hopes of shining, given the last-minute nature of the drive and his unfamiliarity with the new breed of F1 cars. Car 27, Nicola Larini. Since leaving the dreadful Modena Lamborghini behind at the end of 1991, Nicola Larini had been Ferrari's regular test driver, but even if he hadn't had a competitive F1 start since taking over from Ivan Capelli at the end of 1992, he had been ripping it up in touring cars, winning an exciting Italian Super Turismo season in 1992, then heading north and winning the Deutsche Tourenwagenmeisterschaft in 1993, as well as coming second overall to Paul Radicic in the inaugural FIA Touring Car Challenge, a single event billed as the Touring Car World Cup, won overall by Italy, not least thanks to Larini's points. Clearly, then, he's lost none of his competitive edge as he begins the defence of his DTM crown, but a distraction like driving a Ferrari in F1 is certainly a welcome one. With the track, as was traditional for slow twisty tracks, being described as Monaco without the walls, or a kart track, most teams were adding extra downforce wherever they could, with a range of solutions across the grid. Ferrari brought 3 different sets of front wings to try out. Williams had additionally added a couple of little strips onto the nose, which Patrick had explained generated a small anti-vortex effect, and Adrian Newey was working on a whole new front axle for Imola. Over at McLaren, Neil Oatley had reworked the MP4-9 a bit, enlarging the radiators and intakes to try and combat the Peugeot V10's overheating problem, and they also had a new version of the motor, the A6, which, as Jean-Pierre Jabouet explained, wasn't much more powerful than the A4, but revved faster and was more efficient. The Ford engineers had been fettling the Zetec in the back of the Benetton, which, despite being surprisingly powerful for a V8, had been showing some signs of fragility, and the footwork team had been trying to figure out what had caused their gearbox failures in Brazil, and had come here with some new software. And in more visible changes, the Larousse team had arrived with a striking new promotional livery on their cars, replacing the green and yellow of low-alcohol Tourtel with the red and white quarters of the flagship Kronenbourg 1664 brand, with matching overalls for team and drivers. And, thanks to Stefan for pointing this one out in the comments for Brazil, Lotus had taken a leaf out of Ligier's book from last year and had a special art car design livery. Johnny had driven it in Brazil, and it was Pedro's turn this time. It's rather more subtle and less striking compared to Martin Brundle's Ligier from last year, which is probably why it goes mostly unremarked on. These graphics from the Cars and Tracks development project, link in the description, which makes graphics for R-Factor, show the difference well. Go give them a visit if R-Factor sim racing is your bag. Thursday's familiarisation session turned a few heads as drivers got their first feel of the track, with Senna fastest, a second quicker than Schumacher, but then Eric Comas, another second back, then Hill, Häkkinen, Barrichello, Brundle, Berger, Frentzen and Verstappen in the top 10, but of course that didn't mean much, and on Friday they set out to have a proper crack at it. Once again it was Senna fastest, with Schumacher now just 2 tenths behind, but the normal order had reasserted itself with the top 8 slots taken by the Williams, Benetton, Ferrari and McLaren teams. At the other end of the grid, Roland Ratzenberger, the only driver in the field who'd actually driven the track before, had a hair-raising off that the cameras didn't capture and didn't set a time. On Friday evening, Nicola Larini blotted his copybook by accidentally letting slip that he'd been using a special engine management software, and naturally Messrs Briatore, Dennis and Williams all immediately claimed to both media and authorities that they suspected Ferrari had a banned traction control system. Jean Todt, of course, denied everything, but Charlie Whiting, presumably sighing as he saw a lot more of this kind of thing in his future, said he'd look into it, but Ferrari could race under sufferance in the meantime. Those, many of them F1 engineers, who'd said before the season that it would be difficult to police the software side of things, found the words "we told you so" hard to resist. Sunday was hot and sultry, and the track was much less grippy than it had been on Friday, so only those who'd had problems were able to improve their times, and McLaren didn't run at all, figuring it just wasn't worth using the rubber. And Senna had the pole, with Schumacher alongside. Hill was third, half a second behind his team leader, alongside Mika Häkkinen, fourth but nearly a full second off Hill. Veterans Berger and Brundle lined up a pretty happy 5th and 6th. Larini might have done better than a career-best 7th if he hadn't been spun into by Katayama, with Barrichello, Fittipaldi and Verstappen making up a top 10 that included all 3 Brazilians. Frentzen was happy enough with 11th, though his teammate Wendlinger found both race car and spare undrivable and ended up a frustrated 19th. The Tyrrells were a bit disappointed after a great Brazil, but it was still a step up from last year, while just as at Interlagos, the Ligiers and Loti were really struggling, and the Heffel team were hoping that the new 109 chassis would arrive as soon as possible and make a big difference when it did. Suzuki was a respectable 20th in the circumstances, finding it difficult to adjust to passively sprung cars. David Brabham was 25th, and in 26th was Roland Ratzenberger, who'd gone back out on Saturday and set a time 6 seconds off pole, but enough to qualify for his first Grand Prix, at the expense, ironically, of the 2 Pacific cars, who not only just couldn't find grip anywhere, but also detonated 4 Ilmors in the process. Neither the wrangling over rules and regs nor the relative remoteness of the circuit deterred the Japanese fans, who poured into the circuit, around 100,000 of them over the 3 days and 45,000 of a 50,000 capacity for the race on Sunday, which meant that if nothing else, it was a financial success. Sunday was warm again, and most teams had plumped for soft C-compound tyres and 2 stops, though Martin Brundle and Rubens Barrichello had decided to go with Bs and a single stop. Häkkinen, meanwhile, opted to take the start in the spare car with the older A4 engine, which he thought was more reliable. For the first time, and for reasons I haven't entirely been able to determine, the parade lap would take place behind a pace car, a Porsche 911 driven by Charlie Whiting. Senna wasn't happy with the speed Charlie was doing, though, and was alternately doing the usual weaving and then hanging back to boost right up to the 911, all in the quest to get some heat into his tyres. It didn't help that it took quite a while for everyone to line up once they got back to the grid. Once they were all ready to go, Olivier Panis stalled, but Roland Brunschreiter didn't notice in time to abort the sequence, and the race was on. Schumacher, who'd been practicing his starts, got away like a rocket this time and took the lead from a fishtailing Senna, but before Ayrton had a chance to react, Häkkinen nudged him from behind, sending the skittish Williams spinning, where it was promptly T-boned by Laurini's Ferrari, putting both men out and creating a dust cloud in which Comas rear-ended Blundell, eliminating the Tyrrell and sending the Larousse in for a new nose. It had only been the gentlest contact from Häkkinen, and there was a black rubber mark but no damage evident on the McLaren's nose as an unhappy Senna stalked back towards the pits. By the time the replays had been shown from every single angle, Schumacher was already on lap 2 with a 2-second lead over Häkkinen, who had Hill close behind, and the lead Benetton continued pulling away, with Berger leading the rest of the pack a few seconds back from the Häkkinen-Hill pair. On lap 4, Hill had an off-camera spin at the aptly named Revolver corner, where he and others had been caught out in practice, rejoining the track just in time to be swamped by Frentzen and Verstappen, though he managed to fight off Morbidelli to hang on to 9th. Recovering his pace, he had a go at Verstappen at the end of the pit straight, but no dice. Hill was driving a bit raggedly, but put his foot down and passed the Dutch driver into the hairpin. Schumacher, meanwhile, was just lapping Comas following his pit stop, with Panis next up after his slow getaway, while Hill continued his comeback, passing Frentzen, and then Fittipaldi's footwork on the next lap. So on lap 10 of the 83, Schumacher led Häkkinen by 7 seconds, who was 8 seconds ahead of Berger, then Barrichello and Brundle were running close together about 3 seconds behind the Ferrari, with Hill getting larger in Martin's mirrors in 6th place. Hill eased past Brundle a couple of laps later, then Barrichello to go up to 4th. Berger was next up as Damon continued his charge. Brundle and Barrichello, meanwhile, had renewed hostilities and were having a great scrap, with Fittipaldi still in touch behind them too. Soon enough, Hill had caught Berger, just as Beretta's battery conked out and he pulled over, as Gerhard and Damon shot past. Berger was no easy mark though, and even if his car wasn't the match of the Williams, he was at least going to make Hill work for it. On lap 18, just under a quarter distance, Häkkinen was the first of the front runners to make a stop, only for his engine to die and have to be restarted, leaving the fuming Finn stationary for 25 seconds, with Hill coming in while he was still sat there, and the two left together in 9th and 10th. As Häkkinen charged off in pursuit of Morbidelli, little puffs of vapour started coming out of the back of the McLaren. Hydraulic fluid was leaking, and he slowly turned round and came in to retire with a stuck gearbox. All of which had left Schumacher even more comfortably in the lead by 41 seconds over Berger, with the Barrichello-Brundle duel promoted to one for a podium place, at least for the time being. On lap 22, Schumacher made an unhurried stop, followed next time around by Fittipaldi and Verstappen entering and leaving in formation. Barrichello and Brundle were still going at it hammer and tongs, while a combination of another charge and other people's pit stops had got Hill back up to 5th behind them. The Jordan and the McLaren certainly seemed very evenly matched, which was something you could barely have conceived of saying this time last year. But on lap 27, Brundle decided to change strategy and came in for an early stop. At the same time, Berger was in from 2nd, and Martin was followed in by Morbidelli, Herbert and Ratzenberger. But as the cameras followed Gerhard out of the pits and off round the track, Brundle had got out behind Morbidelli and was now sandwiched between the footwork and Verstappen's second Benetton, and all of them were approaching Comas, whose Larousse could really shift, and was handily keeping the others behind him, allowing Barrichello, now 2nd before his own stop, to take full advantage. At least relative to Brundle. On the track, he now had Damon Hill coming past into 2nd place, so Rubens dived in for fuel at the end of lap 31. So with pretty much everyone having made at least one stop, Schumacher now led Hill by nearly 42 seconds, then Berger, Barrichello, the Fittipaldi-Brundle-Verstappen trio still making no impression on Eric Comas, and the last cars unlapped as Schumacher rapidly reeled them in. Verstappen, needless to say, proved no trouble for Schumacher, but the danger now was that Brundle, still intent on Fittipaldi ahead of him, wouldn't notice he now had Schumacher behind him. Fortunately for Michael, Martin sorted the problem out himself by having a go at the footwork and getting all out of shape, allowing Schumacher to nip through and Verstappen to catch right back up again. So, Schumacher was lapping Fittipaldi, who was lapping Comas, who was lapping Lamy, with Ratzenberger and Bernard ahead too. It was getting quite confusing, and the potential for another Interlagos-style pileup was high, as Schumacher was finding it trickier than he was expecting getting past Fittipaldi, who was intent on getting past the LaRousse ahead of him, and again possibly believed that he was fending off Verstappen. Eventually, though, the leader got through, with Brundle forcing his way through in his wake, nearly rear-ending Schumacher in the process, but somehow everyone got through okay, and then Comas saved everyone any further trouble by pitting on lap 39. Hill was still giving it the beans at half distance before coming in on lap 42, a great stop getting him back out still second, just ahead of Berger, and charging off to try and build his lead back up over Berger and see what he could do about Schumacher's whopping 52-second lead before the German made his second stop. The Japanese fans, already disappointed with their idol Senna being punted out on turn 1, were then deflated further when Ukyo Katayama's Yamaha gave up, and then Suzuki's steering failed, and he ended up in a barrier 2 laps later. Verstappen, meanwhile, had been pushing Fittipaldi hard for the last point, until the Brazilian peeled in for his second stop, and for all Hill's efforts, Schumacher continued to ease away in the lead without really appearing to try. Indeed, Michael had set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race all the way back on lap 10, and just hadn't needed to push since. Not far behind Michael on the track, Barrichello and Brundle were back at it, but before we could enjoy their battle, Hill was pulling over an arm in the air. His transmission had gone, and for the first time since Adelaide 1992, the Williams team would not be troubling the scorers. With Berger well over a minute behind, Schumacher had time for a full oil change and service at his second stop, getting back out still 52 seconds to the good, and the cameras could return to the Rubens-Martin fight, which was once again over third place, with Verstappen and Fittipaldi 5th and 6th. Rubens nearly punted off Ratzenberger as the Austrian was a bit tardy getting out of his way, and then Brundle cut the duel short by coming in for his second stop, using one of the brand new sets the team had saved by not running on Saturday. He emerged 5th, while Fittipaldi had also stopped and dropped behind Frentzen. With 29 laps still to go, it was looking like Schumacher might lap the whole field again as his teammate Verstappen stopped. The young Dutchman, in just his 54th single-seater race of any kind, got away again and emerged just ahead of Frentzen, but in his eagerness to stay ahead, he overdid it on his cold tyres and spun into the gravel trap and out of the race. Flavio Briatore on the pit wall didn't look impressed. Berger was in next, which promoted Barrichello to second despite a good stop, and he emerged just in front of Schumacher, but didn't seem inclined to let the Benetton lap him, and instead concentrated on charging off in pursuit of Barrichello, just over 5 seconds ahead, before the Jordan made its own second stop. When he did, it all went wrong for the youngest man in the race as he stalled his engine on the getaway and lost 20 seconds while his Hart V10 was restarted, which had let Martin Brundle through into third. And in fact, Martin was only 5 seconds or so behind Gerhard and charging, scenting an unexpected second place, though in order to get to grips with Berger, he'd have to unlap himself from Schumacher first too. He was certainly giving it the good college try, as Pierluigi Martini found his brake pedal suddenly inoperable and was able to coast to a halt at Atwood and head back. Brundle was still behind Schumacher, but was getting the gap down to Berger, now just over 3.7 seconds, while pulling away from Barrichello, who was going to have to settle for 4th, which would still be his joint best result. Except that Martin Brundle had been slowly picking up rubbish in his side pods, and his Peugeot had been getting hotter and hotter, and on lap 68 he came into the pits to retire before anything went bang. What body language was visible with just 2 hands and a helmet, showing just how hacked off he was. But Brundle's anger was Barrichello's joy as he reclaimed 3rd place, and the footwork team were now running strongly in 4th and 5th places, with Frentzen 6th, Wendlinger 7th, an additional lap down, followed by Alboreto, then another lap behind was Comas. They all moved up another place when Morbidelli's engine let go, dumped oil on the track and his own rear wheels, and Atwood Corner claimed another victim, the footwork beached in a rather awkward spot on the curbs. So Wendlinger was promoted into the points, but had Alboreto right behind him and gunning for a point. The veteran made an unlikely lunge from way too far back and ploughed right into the back of the Sauber, taking both out. So with Eric Comas now up into the points and 10 laps still to go, Schumacher just had to keep it on the island while everyone else threw their cars off, the German holding station behind Berger rather than take even the small risk of lapping him. With everyone apparently chastened by that late flurry of retirements, the last 10 laps proceeded uneventfully, as Schumacher crossed the line to take career win number 4, having as good as lapped the whole field again. Berger took second place, and Barrichello was a delighted third for his and the team's first ever podium place. Christian Fittipaldi was fourth, his best finish yet, and a valuable 3 points for the cash-strapped footwork team. Heinz-Harald Frentzen took 2 points for his first race finish and just his second start, and Eric Comas took the final point for Larousse to underline the value of bringing the car home. 3 laps down, but the point counted just the same. For the second race in a row, Johnny Herbert was 7th and on the same lap as Comas, but neither he nor Lamy nor the 2 Ligiers behind them had really been at the races so far. And the last man running 5 laps down but delighted just to finish his first race was Roland Ratzenberger. All 3 drivers on the podium looked absolutely beside themselves with joy, even an old hand like Berger delighted with second place after his trying 1993. Rubens Barrichello's triumph in third was even sweeter after he thought he'd thrown it away, and as a cherry on top, the 4 points put him second and Jordan third in their respective tables. He'd been in tears finishing 4th at Interlagos, but made an effort, with the world's TV cameras on him, to give smiles rather than tears. Flavio Briatore was cornered on the podium by both Schumacher and Berger, who made sure the Italian got a thorough soaking in champagne. So for the first time since 1981, McLaren hadn't got a point on the board after 2 races, and Williams had just Hill's 6th from Brazil, with everyone's pre-season favourite Ayrton Senna yet to finish, let alone score. After the race, the Brazilian quietly told his teammate that he was certain there was something fishy about the Benetton, and he thought he'd heard a strange noise coming from the engine. Ian Harrison, the Williams team manager, had popped out to make sure Senna didn't lamp the unfortunate Larini, and the cameras then followed them back to the pits, though stories persist that Senna spent some time by turn 1 listening to the Benetton as it came past. In any case, he'd heard enough, in whatever circumstances, to confirm his suspicions in his own mind at least. The Aida track wasn't a classic, but it had produced a pretty entertaining race in the end, and it might have been even better if not for Senna's early exit. In 2 weeks' time, the teams would reconvene on more familiar ground, Imola, for the San Marino Grand Prix.